In this module, we'll be talking about cultural appropriation and sensitive ways of learning about other cultures. First, we'll go over some definitions and terminology. We'll look at a few examples of cultural appropriation on college campuses. Then we'll discuss why cultural appropriation is wrong and why it perpetuates racism. We'll look at a psychological study conducted on the effects of cultural appropriation, and then we'll cover a few tips on how you can go about avoiding cultural appropriation. So this is a really typical example of a college student dressing up with an Indian headdress. Another common example of cultural appropriation is during Halloween, when college students dress up in various costumes depicting different cultures, and often the costumes are rather stereotypical of the culture. So let's talk about some definitions and terminology. What is cultural appropriation? Okay, this is the act of taking objects, things, or different elements from a culture that's not your own, and doing so without showing that you understand or respect the culture. Usually, cultural appropriation involves a power dynamic in which members of a dominant culture take the elements of an oppressed or minority culture. This is quite different from cultural exchange. Cultural exchange occurs when groups share their knowledge, technology, customs, and so on. It lacks a power dynamic, and it implies that all of the groups are equal. We can also differentiate cultural assimilation. This occurs when a minority culture adopts the cultural elements and practices of a dominant culture. It's an assimilation process such that the minority culture that's marginalized loses elements of their own culture, and they're absorbed into the dominant culture. So, for example, it wouldn't be cultural appropriation for a Mexican immigrant to learn to speak English, because English is the dominant language in the United States. And then lastly, we can differentiate cultural appreciation. This is when you can learn about customs and practices about another culture, but do it in a way that's respectful. So the main difference then between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation is power. So for example, it wouldn't be cultural appropriation to use common objects such as paper. Paper was invented by the Chinese, because paper is not a product of cultural exploitation and oppression. Another example is it wouldn't be cultural appropriation for a Caucasian person to wear a Japanese kimono to a traditional wedding in Japan if they were invited to do so. However, it would be cultural appropriation for a Caucasian woman to wear a Japanese kimono to her high school prom just because she thought it was cool and funny. So, cultural appropriation perpetuates racism. First of all, it completely ignores the violent history of oppression. It ignores the fact that the culture that's being borrowed from is typically economically and historically disadvantaged. Second of all, it allows members of the dominant culture to love and appreciate elements of the minority culture, but completely disregard the people. So, for example, Caucasian celebrities can wear cornrows, and that's considered a cool fashion statement. But at the same time, if an African American woman wears cornrows to work, she's criticized and stigmatized for doing so. Third of all, cultural appropriation allows members of the dominant culture to take credit for things that they didn't create. So, for example, country music is actually born out of the antebellum South. A fourth example, it allows dominant groups to profit from oppressed groups. So, for example, the fashion industry uses Native American culture to sell its lingerie. And then lastly, cultural appropriation perpetuates racism. When you dress up in a Halloween costume and it depicts a culture in a stereotypical way, you're perpetuating this image of stereotypes, and it misrepresents the culture. So you might be wondering, well, what's the big deal? If I wear a costume on Halloween, am I really bothering anybody? Well, research suggests that there are negative effects of cultural appropriation. For example, in this one study conducted by Freiberg, Marcus, Oyserman, and Stone, they conducted a study in which they had American Indian high school students who were residing on an Indian reservation view images that were stereotypical. There were 4 conditions in this study. One group of students were presented with images of Chief Wahoo, and there's an example of Chief Wahoo up here in the corner. He's the mascot of the Cleveland Indians Major League Baseball team. A second group of students were presented with images of Pocahontas, the Disney character. A third group read information that was stereotypically and negative about American Indian youth. So, for example, that 50% of American Indian high school students drop out of high school. And then lastly, a fourth group was in the control condition, and they saw a neutral image. Afterwards, all of the students completed a measure of self-esteem. And this is what they found. Of the 4 groups, the participants with the lowest self-esteem were those who saw the image of Chief Wahoo. And that was significantly lower than the control group. And I think what is very notable is that the group of students who saw Chief Wahoo had lower self-esteem than students who had just read about really stereotypical negative outcomes about their culture. So this suggests that indeed cultural appropriation, something as innocuous as an image of Chief Wahoo, can have negative effects on minority group members. So here are some tips on how to avoid cultural appropriation. First of all, consider the source. Where are you borrowing or buying from? The closer you are to the original source, the less likely you are appropriating. So, for example, are you buying Native American lingerie from Victoria's Secret, or are you actually traveling to a reservation to purchase some cultural item? Secondly, significance. Is the cultural object of great significance in that community, such as a Native American headdress? Or is it something that's just normally used on a daily basis, like paper? Religious objects, for example, are things that you definitely want to avoid. Third, consider similarity. Is the cultural object a direct copy of that object of cultural heritage, or is it just inspired by it, with only a very slight resemblance? And again, the example of Victoria's Secret's Native American lingerie comes to mind. Consider the context. And in particular, is the culture that you're borrowing from a minority culture that's been historically disadvantaged or oppressed in some way? Secondly, consider the benefit. How exactly are you benefiting from borrowing from the cultural group? Are you doing it to truly honor and respect the culture? Are you interested in learning about the culture? Or are you just selling a product or having fun on Halloween? So in summary, cultural appropriation does have negative effects on members of minority cultures. Consider the impact of your actions, not just your intentions. You might have no intention whatsoever of offending someone, but indeed your actions may have a very negative effect on people, such as their self-esteem. There's many ways to learn about avoiding cultural appropriation, and there's some examples in our readings. And lastly, it's okay to celebrate diversity and to learn about the norms and practices of minority cultures, but you want to make sure that you're doing so in a respectful way.